So our passage for this morning is James chapter 3, and we're going to be looking at verses 13 through to 18. And really the question that James is asking of us this morning is, who is wise among you? So take a look around. This is the question. Who is wise among you? Look, who do you think? I mean, what do we reckon? I mean, we've been looking at James now for about 8 weeks. We've been considering how wisdom works in James's letter. We've seen the basis of wisdom, which is faith. We've seen wisdom in trials, wisdom in action, wisdom in relationships, wisdom through faith and works, wisdom in speech. So look around. Who is wise among you? Anyone volunteering to say me? No, okay, interesting. A lot of people lacking faith. I mean, we will see over the next few weeks some other areas of life that James is concerned with us understanding wisdom. But this particular section we're about to read has a real focus on the principle of wisdom generally, set apart from those specific areas of concern. It's like, what is wisdom is really the question he's digging into. He wants us to understand again what the markers of godly or heavenly wisdom is as opposed to earthly wisdom. So we're going to look at 3 areas today. What is wisdom? Godly wisdom versus earthly wisdom, and recognizing godly wisdom. How do we see it? So let's read together in James chapter 3 and from verses 13 to 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. The Word of God. So, our question, what is wisdom? Well, we can say a few things about this. The first is, it's not knowledge. This is not about just knowing more stuff. This would have been quite common among the Greek hearers of this letter. For them, wisdom equates with knowledge. It's not experience, which I think in our culture is often how we define wisdom. If you've got grey hair, then you're wise. And if you don't have grey hair, you can't be wise. And there's too many of you just nodding your head there, but I'm making no comment about that. So if it's not those two things, so what is it? Well, I want to suggest to you that we've already seen in James that wisdom is understood as a gift, so something that comes from out with. And James has been very concerned to help us see that wisdom is the ability to live rightly. It's not about something that's stuck in our heads. Wisdom is tangible in our life. It's visible. So when we look around and say, who is among you that's wise, we're not looking for the person with grey hair who we go, it must be them. Or the person with the most amount of degrees in the room. It's not them. We're looking for something much deeper. Something that goes further. In James, wisdom, it seems, follows on from the Old Testament writers' understanding of wisdom. We talked about this away at the beginning. Proverbs 1:7 Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. Proverbs 2:9, wisdom enables us to discern what is right and just. Proverbs 2:20 leads us to walk in the ways of good men and keep to the paths of righteousness. Paths of the righteous, sorry. Wisdom, then, is this thing that is both intangible and yet visible. We must be able to see it. And two friends of mine wrote a Bible study on James many years ago, and they wrote this: wisdom is, for James, a way of life based on an allegiance to the way from above. Christian wisdom entails a dependence upon God from the heart to love Him and our neighbors as ourselves. That begins to grasp something of what James is saying. And I love that idea that for wisdom is a way of life based on an allegiance. This is about, to whom do you owe your allegiance? Where are you focused? Who are you hanging on to? Who are you serving? And when we do that, somehow the Christian wisdom entails this dependence on God to love Him and our neighbors as ourselves. This is, I think, what wisdom is and what James is trying to help us see in this passage and indeed in the whole section here. But he contrasts godly wisdom versus earthly wisdom. So, in this section here, he says, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So first of all, what do we mean by this earthly wisdom? Is this just the kind of thing that you can do? You go around, like my granddad used to be great at this. He would go, the coos are in the corner of the field. It's going to rain in 15 minutes. And he was right. Like, is that what we mean by earthly wisdom? The corn's blowing this way, that means that. Or red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. All those kind of exciting things. There was red sky this morning at about 7 a.m. It was very lovely. We don't mean that. When we read in the Bible about earthly and heavenly, this is back to this allegiance idea. This is about systems of power and structures that at work. So earthly wisdom comes from the earthly structures and the earthly power places. James says they lead to destruction. And he contrasts this with heavenly wisdom. And we can see that godly wisdom or heavenly wisdom and earthly wisdom give rise to different kinds of fruit. Earthly wisdom characterized by envy and jealousy, leading to division. Godly wisdom rooted in humility. Let them show their wisdom by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So when we're wrestling with this, and nobody was very keen to say, yes, I'm wise, because that feels, not very humble, so well done. But also, we should aspire to wisdom. But when we read in a moment, or look further in a moment at the kinds of things that the fruit of godly wisdom are, then we recognize, I fall a bit short here. I mean, maybe you don't, but I do. And I'm like, okay, what am I going to do with that? Does that mean that I'm just driven all the time by earthly wisdom? Because sometimes I can see that in me. I can see envy in me. The church we were at for the wedding, I had serious building envy. It was awesome. And Nick, the sound system would blow your socks off, man. I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's not godly wisdom. That is definitely earthly wisdom. But I can see that in me so clearly. And so I'm like, whoa, what am I going to do? How do we do this? Is this something that means I've just got to try harder? Is this another burden to carry? That would be odd, wouldn't it? That's not how we understand the gospel. So, what then is the godly wisdom? Because I'm going to spend no time at all thinking about earthly wisdom. I just want us to recognize there is this contrast, because I don't care about earthly wisdom. It is what it is. It's out there. It's bad for us, right? But godly wisdom, that's what we want. That's what we're after. It's what we aspire to. And I think it's characterized by not 3 things in a good sermon, 11 things. So a few of you sat up there. There we go. Don't worry, just a small comment on each of them as we go. This is a combination of a couple of things we take out. The first few verses of that, and then mostly from verses 17 and 18. The other thing to notice here is a complete sideline and has nothing to do with my sermon, but a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the faith and works section, I managed to take something that nobody thought was complicated and then convince you it was complicated, and for maybe 1 or 2 of you I managed to get you back to, oh, that makes sense again. Do you remember that sermon? Yeah, there's lots of you still sitting there going, I'm still confused, but don't worry about it. And one of the reasons for that is that the language that was used was really complicated in the Greek, and it meant that it was quite difficult to fathom exactly who was you and who was I, and you remember that. Well, this section has something of the same kind of vibe going on. It was like James is writing and he's getting all carried away, and he twice in this one little section uses words that appear nowhere else in the New Testament. Nowhere. Just, he was obviously on a roll, and he's like throwing in these words, like this one and this one and this one, and so it gets some of these. There are great chunks of commentaries given over to, is it this or is it that? So it doesn't matter, because I'm going to tell you what I think my best take on it is this morning. But if you disagree with me, you're wrong. I mean, there are others who would be delighted to engage in a conversation with you about that. So, what is godly wisdom? It is a good life, says James. Let them show it by their good life, which is presumably tied to the section immediately before, which has us talking about good works and good words. And so maybe we should better understand that rather than good life as good conduct, by the way that we live. This isn't the good life in the kind of in the sense of what is it for me to live the good life? What is it for me to have all that I need in my life to fulfill that? This is about living a life of good conduct. And so godly wisdom is a well-lived life, a good conduct life. And then, as we've said, we see that it's a life of humility. And I want to pause on this for just a second, because I think this is one of the places where we begin to see James really reflecting some of Jesus' teaching. And I think here of Jesus' life, we're told that, of course, that Jesus is meek. You see, nobody in the first century thought that humility or meekness was a good characteristic in anyone. It's not worthy of comment. That actually what you want is someone powerful and strong and who can take what they need. That's someone that I want to look up to. Someone who's humble and meek. Well, why would you be like that? I remember listening to Tom Holland talk about how he thought that movement of humility only entered the world when there was a God who died on a cross. That whole story is upside down, and it's at that point that it begins to change the world's look on what humility could be. And so the idea that wisdom is about humility and not about having a gargantuan head with loads of information in it. Most of you in here are old enough to remember the Tefal adverts, right? The men with the rather large heads. Like, the point was they were wise and smart and clever, right? And we must not make the mistake and think that our world is so different today than it was then. I think if we look at what's happening in the West, and I always try and stay loads away from politics because that's a dangerous place to go. But when we can observe across the Western world a rise of what's often called populism, we see not a desire for meekness and humility, but a desire for power and boastfulness. Friends, that is not what James says wisdom is. Wisdom is found in the humble and in the meek. He then goes on into our list down here. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all, or primarily, pure, blameless, holy, an absence of a sinful attitude, an absence of self-seeking. Do you remember a few weeks ago we talked about the idea of disordered desires? We talked about it in the context of the John Mark Comer describing the battle that we all enter into, that the devil's deceptive schemes land on our disordered desires and are affirmed by a sinful society. And we reflected on the fact that the first and the last we can't do anything about, but the disordered desires, they are kind of our responsibility. And so I think another way for us to talk about purity in this sense is to talk about ordered desires. Because it's not bad to have desires. We're made, we're loving people, we're driven from the heart. So what is it to have an ordered desire? This is one of the fruits of wisdom, it says. Wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, holy, ordered desires. And then it's peace-loving. And in some ways this is being contrasted with the earthly desires that are bringing selfish ambition and disorder and evil practice. Instead of that, we are peace-loving, the opposite of divisiveness. These are the kinds of people that we're meant to be. We're not supposed to be Twitter warriors. We're not supposed to be people who are arguing with everyone. We're supposed to be peace-loving, finding space where shalom dwells, creating place where shalom dwells. We've talked often in this church about Jeremiah 29, the call to the exiles to dwell in the city and to seek its peace and prosperity, to seek its shalom. Wisdom is to be people who seek the peace of God where we are. So in your workplace, what is it to be a peace lover in your workplace? What is it to be a peace lover in your home? The next one, considerate. Not standing up for your own rights, but yielding where possible. Maybe gentle would be another way to put this. To be thinking of others more than of yourself. Now, we know this is what Paul writes, Philippians 2, for Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing. This is the attitude that we are supposed to have in ourselves. And I think James is taking that idea and saying, here, this is how we are supposed to be, because wisdom leads us to be these kind of considerate people. Not standing up for our own rights, but yielding where possible to others. Then the next one, submissive. Who wants to struggle with this one with me? Yeah? There's a couple. Nick, yeah, thanks. It's a weird one, right? I bumped on this pretty hard. I was like, submissive? I don't think so. I'll be nice to people, but submissive? Are you joking? So this is one of those weird words that doesn't really appear anywhere else. And I thought, oh, that's good, because it must just be a bad translation, and I don't need to be submissive. And unfortunately, it's about as good as it gets. The idea is, and I think in our world today, we would be remarkable people to live like this. It means that we're open to persuasion, that we are not closed-minded and shut off, but that we are willing to listen. And if we think about the people we know who are wise, they behave like this, right? I might not have used the word submissive about it, but if I think of the people who I know who are wisest, they're always the listeners in the group. They're always the people asking the questions and drawing things out of other people. I think I've told this story before. A guy called Jim Houston, who started Regent College, has written loads of books. He was a pioneer of spiritual theology. And he's Scottish, so we could be proud of that. Another one. And he is, he's an old man now, and he was an old man. We got invited to him and his wife Rita's house for lunch with all the other Scottish students at Regent, and they loved telling Scottish stories and things like that. And Jim could talk. He loved to tell stories. And so we were sat at the dinner table, and he's regaling us with, when Lewis said this to me, and went on, and I'm sitting there going, who's Lewis? Oh, he means C.S. Lewis, and he meant he was sitting having a conversation with them. And I'm like, oh, I better pay attention here. Anyway, his wife Rita had been in the kitchen, and she comes storming through, and she says, right, lunch is nearly ready. And Jim, you need to shut up. Nobody wants to hear these stories anyway. And we're all sitting there going, no, not really, we do. But later, after lunch, we went and sat in the front room, and he just started asking people questions. He turned to Karen, and he said, what do you do? And she said, I was a doctor. He said, so how do you see Jesus in your work? I'll still never forget him. He was sat on the little couch, Karen was sat on the floor, and he was utterly fascinated by how she was going to answer this question, because it was an area he didn't know about, and he wanted to learn. He was being submissive. He was the smartest person in the room, and it wasn't close. And yet he was utterly fascinated by something he didn't know about. He was submissive. He wanted to learn. He was open to persuasion. Friends, I think we would be a remarkable community of witness if we lived like that in this world today. James goes on. Anybody else exhausted already by the fruit of wisdom? He goes on, full of mercy. Again, I think this is deeply ingrained in the Jesus life. Jesus, of course, Matthew 5, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. This is the place that we see, I think, the Jesus teaching coming out in James in the midst of this wisdom. James obviously very concerned about mercy earlier in James, and it's related to loving our neighbor. And so we're not surprised that this appears. It's back to that sense that wisdom is not just something we think, but something we do. Then we say, wisdom is full of mercy and good fruit. And again, of course, James says that because for him, the idea that mercy would not have action or fruit would be an anathema. That's number 8, if you were counting. 3 to go. Deep breath, nearly there. Number 9, it's impartial. Again, one of those weird words doesn't appear anywhere else. James 2, 1 to 4, which we've already looked at, which is this thing of not showing partiality among the rich and the poor. Wisdom doesn't do that. Wisdom sees past all of that to something else. It doesn't show partiality. Number 10, it's sincere. What does that mean? It means without hypocrisy. It's not divided in its intention. It's not like, well, I'll say and do this thing so that I can get this thing behind here. If I am nice to this person, then I know they will do something good for me over here. That's not the kind of wisdom. That's earthly wisdom. And that would have been very, very common in James's world. It's called patronage. And quite often you would do something for someone, but the only reason you would do something for someone is because you knew that maybe next week or down the road they would now owe you one and they'd have to pay it back. So we're sincere, without hypocrisy, undivided in our intention. And then finally, I've termed this last one effective. This last little verse here, it feels slightly out of place because he suddenly says, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. And I think the point he's making is that this is effective. That wisdom is effective. It makes people into peacemakers who sow and reap in righteousness. In other words, who are obedient to God. Wisdom leads to obedience to God, effective obedience to God. Which feels like a bit of a circle because wisdom begins in obedience to God as well, I think. It's a long list of things. I don't expect you to be able to come in next Sunday and recount them all. There will not be a test. Or will there? I wonder what it would mean for us to pursue being a community of wisdom like this. To be a people who pursue this kind of wisdom. I really do think we would be a community radically different, certainly than the world around us, but I think we would continually be shaped like Jesus. This list, I don't know if it reminds anyone of anything, but it strikes me that it's very like the fruits of the Spirit, right? That it sounds familiar to us. Paul in Galatians 5:22 to 23 says this. Oops. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. They're not the same words, but to use a trendy modern term, they've got the same vibe, right? There's a striking similarity. Humility, peaceableness, good behavior are central to both. What Paul attributes to the Holy Spirit, James does to wisdom. We could probably take a whole sermon on that because I think the Old Testament does something quite similar at times. But I think above all, what that does is point us to the reality that this is not about us trying harder. I don't want us to leave here today thinking, oh, if I just try a bit harder, if I get a bit better at being any one of these things, I will be wiser. But if instead we recognize that, like Paul with the fruits of the Spirit, that this is about us receiving gift. This is about us receiving Holy Spirit, and then the fruit is born, then we begin to realize that while we can be active participants, we cannot do it on our own. That we must not do it on our own because that becomes anti-gospel. The gospel is God alone saved us. God alone will save us. God alone is saving us. And yet we get to participate. The good news is that we don't have to hop over some high bar. For Jesus has brought that bar right down low. But we get to strive for that goal, but striving in joy and hope, recognizing even that the good things that we do are a gift from the Holy Spirit. They're not earned or learned. So, who is wise among you? I wonder if the answer is simple as the one who leans most on God. It's not clever, it's not fancy, it's not the one with the most degrees, it's not the one who's been around church the longest, it's not the one who has some profound spiritual encounter with God. It's not the one who's going on mission. It's not the one who's been on mission. It's not the one who's lived longest. It's not the one who has read most of the Bible. It's not the one who's read all the commentaries that have been written. It's the one who day to day says, God, I need you.